Go ahead.
Okay.
I see an old and a new. So obviously the new one.
Oh, the old micro summary. Yeah, so let's start with the new micro summary. So the new micro summary is the poet's own poetry killed him.
Mm-hmm.
The knowledge of his mortality inhibits his poetry. While he lived, his poetry caused confusion. He was destined to sing of the nature of love, but he didn't understand love.
Okay.
He anxiously wonders if his poetry was similar to a cruel pagan deity. He also frets over its ephemerality.
Now I'm looking at the old micro summary, and you made the transition. You said the poet commits suicide.
Right. So I've abandoned.
So what compelled you to, one, light on that interpretation and then abandon that?
Okay. And because it says the bell rope dispatches me.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, I know what it was. It was the blood. So there's a stanza later down where he says blood, but
no answer could blood hold such a lofty tower.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I originally thought that blood was like his suicide.
Okay.
But now I'm thinking it's lifeblood spirituality.
That was my inclination to interpret it that way too.
Yeah. So that's what mainly does it for him.
Okay.
And further, if he's above above a hangman's pit,
mm-hmm.
if he's being hung by this bell rope,
yes,
then it's not a suicide. It's he's being sentenced to death.
So I'm sorry. So where are you inferring a gallows of execution versus a gallows of suicide? I'm a little unclear on that.
Well, I've abandoned the suicide.
Right. But what was your initial thinking? I'm just curious.
Oh, my initial thinking was the blood, and then maybe when I read this first stanza.
Yes.
So let's just reread the first stanza. The bell rope that gathers God at dawn dispatches me as though I dropped down the knell of a spent day to wander the cathedral lawn from pit to crucifix. Feet chilled on steps from hell.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess I just didn't understand that this gallows was really built by somebody else,
mm-hmm.
and that he's being condemned.
Are you taking the broken tower literally?
Well, I interpret the tower as his poetic composition.
Okay.
There's another critic that agrees with me on this point. I forget the critic's name. And then the tower is symbol for the poet's. The bells are the symbol for the poet's imminent death.
Okay.
Because when you're ringing the bells,
right.
I realize this is written before "For Whom the Bell Tolls."
Right, of course.
But I kind of think of church bells ringing because it's a funeral.
Well, I think of my interpretation is a little different. I think the bells are symbols of poetry and the poetic expression, and then the tower is how the powers that be, religion, etc., kind of box in and try to control and regulate poetry, which an interpretation which I think carries on throughout the text. One thing I found interesting, it says, "Filled from pit to crucifix, feet chill on steps from hell," versus to hell.
Yeah.
Which I thought was of interest, and then of course Cathedral Lawn. I think we can agree. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Well, so how do you interpret "feet chill on steps from hell"?
Well, initially I was thinking, we have pit to crucifix, so the crucifixion, and then ultimately Christ rises out of hell.
And by the way, we have to point out that this is a little strange because if you've been hung on the gallows,
yes,
why would you then go to be crucified? Because you're already dead.
No. So I'm just saying. So the crucifix is not the literal crucifixion. I think Cathedral Lawn is a graveyard, personally. So we have crucifixes, for instance. We have pits in these graveyards, crucifixes. But again, when it says chips on steps from hell, that entails a departure from hell, which is what threw me off. I don't think it's an important distinction, but it is just something that puzzled me at first.
Well, first off, let me write this down.
Okay.
Because your Cathedral Lawn as graveyard, I didn't get that, so hold on a second.
Sure.
Okay, so back to this preposition "from" before the word "hell."
Yes.
So I interpreted that this ungrammatical fragment as My feet were chilled standing on steps from hell.
Okay.
But I really didn't notice this preposition from. So are you saying that he's rising from hell?
Oh, not at all. No, I'm just saying it may be a reference to that progress of Christ from death to hell and out of hell again. Maybe. Oh, and I only say that because it's within a cathedral, and cathedrals are organized symbolically on the basis of religious stories and principles. Again, it is not my. It is. I don't think it's significant at all in terms of the rest of the poem, but it is something to call it the greatest question mark.
Okay.
So the bell rope that gathers God at dawn.
Yeah.
What do you think?
Well, I think that this is the lasso that hangs the person.
And God, so gathering God is calling God to take the soul or something?
Yeah, or calling God to take the soul. And also bell rope. So if bell is a symbol for poetry, then this is the lasso of poetry hanging him. He's being hung by poetry.
I ultimately moved away from the gallows interpretation. The bell. So I think we have a distinction, night and day. Okay. Now I had to jump ahead. The stars are caught and hived in the sun's ray. Okay.
Well, let me just read the second stanza.
Go right ahead.
Have you not heard? Have you not seen that core of shadows in the tower, whose shoulders sway antiphonal carillons launched before? The stars are caught and hived in the sun's ray. Okay, so go ahead with the stars are caught and hived in the sun's ray.
Let me say this. So I'm talking, what my interpretation pertains to how poetry, the expression of poetry, is limited and boxed by convention, by religion, etc. So the bell rope that gathers God, I don't necessarily have an interpretation like death or hanging or gallows. This is merely what initiates, gathers God at dawn. So, when at night, how should I put this? Okay, the stars are caught and hived in the sun's ray. Now, what was your interpretation of that?
I interpreted that as just a catastrophe.
Okay.
Let me justify it.
Go ahead.
So, now I might be wrong about this, but it seems to me that if stars are put into the sun, that would be a catastrophic event. A lot of the life of the universe would cease.
Right.
So, but it doesn't matter all that much because it's just an adverb phrase describing when this happened. But I'm still sticking by the interpretation that it means catastrophe. Now, it could also, you could interpret it positively. You could say, well, if more stars are put into the sun becomes even more brighter. Okay. Let's just ignore the fact that this would kill a lot of life. Let's just interpret it as a surreal image where bigger is better. You could interpret it positively as the sun becoming larger.
Well, my interpretation was different. I didn't take the stars literally getting sucked into the sun, so to speak. I thought we're transitioning from night to day. So I'm thinking it's just simply when there's dawn, the stars become invisible due to the rising of the sun.
Oh, that's an idea.
That was my thinking. Now, part of my interpretation is the stars represent poets and the sun represents convention or God, such that when the sun rises, the stars' individual poetic voices are lost, or they're sucked in or overwhelmed by convention, religion, etc. So the sun's ray, that convention and religion, is the same as God at dawn in the first stanza. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. But I want to hold off yet on...
Oh, it's fine. The great thing about great poetry is, we can get these widely varied interpretations and we can really turn this kind of thing out, which is fun,
But just to digress,
yes.
I still kind of think that you should be able to understand it.
I concur, but alternative interpretations can still go a long way.
Yeah, like when there's insufficient evidence.
Right.
Okay,
so what I was... so let me ask you this. I like the core of shadows in the tower. Your interpretation.
Well, I interpreted the core of shadows as mourners at his funeral.
But why would the mourners be in a tower, though?
Yeah, that's not explained.
I think the cores of shadows are the bells themselves, whose shoulders sway carillons. Bells have shoulders, of course, and of course in their swaying they put out that music, those tones, which was my interpretation.
Well, but you could also interpret it as people, when they're moving the bells, their shoulders are also swaying.
Well, that's true, but traditionally speaking, it doesn't take many parties to ring bells, as I recall.
Just takes
So
one.
he's usually, well, it only says right here, there's a bell rope, one, so it'd be one sexton pulling on all these bells. I guess.
Oh, so you're saying that the bell rope is that rope which hangs down from the bell?
Yes, precisely.
Oh, it's not a hangman's rope.
Yeah. I mean, initially I thought the symbol could involve both, but I ultimately moved away from the gallows portion.
Yeah, I kind of think you might be a little right about the bell rope not being a lasso. Hold on a second.
Mm-hmm. What's wrong?
Well, I still want to go back to stanza 1.
Okay, cool.
So, how do you interpret the bell rope dispatches me as though I dropped down the knell?
The bell rope summons God, and that same signal drives me away.
Drives me, but all right. So it's driving him away. But what does that mean?
Well, the bell rope gathers God at dawn, and I identify that with convention, etc., etc. And he doesn't want to be held within convention, so he moves away from that as much as possible, away from that influence.
Now, I dropped down the knell of a spent day. How's that?
Drop down the knell of a spent day. Well, the knell, of course, is like the death knell, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
So temporarily, he is not going to be able to speak his own poetry, for instance. He's going to be caught up within convention, within society.
Well, I interpret it as...
I think I have your note. Give me a sec. Now spent day. So you...
Well, here, let me just read.
Yeah, please go right ahead.
So does Crane mean he dropped the knell of a spent day down? Like he dropped the knell down?
I'm not sure what you mean.
Well, see, the knell is a sound. Yes,
that's correct.
It's not a physical object. It's a sound. So I think... So does he mean he dropped the knell down?
The knell of a spent day, I guess, would be the closing of the day.
Well, hold on.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
That's the most, even though admittedly knell is a type of sound and sounds are only dropped in a figurative sense. The other reading would be that the poet dropped down the knell much as one drops down a tunnel, but it's not very possible to drop down a sound. All right?
Mm-hmm.
So to drop the knell of a spent day down would mean something like he dropped the knell down, which signaled a spent day.
That's what I'm thinking. It's at the end of the day. Mm-hmm. It's at the end of a spent day, and he is dispatched. Think of it like a changing of the guard almost.
Yeah, and hold on. Knell is almost exclusively used in the sense of a death knell.
Correct.
Very few verbs are used in relation to knell, the most common being to sound, and that is probably what drop down means here.
Mm-hmm.
Crane is sounding his own death knell, which signals the end of a spent day, and I would take day as a synecdoche for life, so he's talking about an exhausted life,
this is expressive of suicidality
or death. So
go ahead. I'm sorry.
So it could be. So we'll abandon the lasso interpretation, but still, they're sounding this bell because it's his funeral, and. But it's you got to look at as though. So this is just a simile. So the bell rope dispatches him as if I had sounded my own death knell regarding my useless life.
So the death knell is the end of his life. Mm-hmm. But it says the knell of a spent day. I don't think this is death or suicidality. It's just we're transitioning from night, where he is active with his poetry, like the stars, into the day. So it's this what's the word, circadian, I think. We're not dealing with death images so much. I mean, it's night, day, dawn, etc. So I think that when it says drop down the knell of a spent day, it's not suicidality or death, the end of his life. It's the end of his work period, of his livelihood, and he's going to end a day, the next night, or next day, he'll rise up again, if you will. I mean, I really moved away entirely from the suicide interpretation.
Well, what about just poetry kills him?
Why would poetry kill him?
Well, let's look at the rest of the poem.
Okay, yeah. So where are we? So do you want to go into stanza 3?
Yeah, let's go to stanza 3. So,
Okay.
The bells, I say, the bells break down their tower and swing I know not where.
Mm-hmm.
Their tongues engrave membrane through marrow,
Mm-hmm.
my long scattered score of broken intervals, and I their sexton slave.
Okay.
Now, first off, you're saying that sexton has a double meaning.
Gravedigger and the person who pulls the bell, the ropes of the bell.
All right. Yeah, that's... but you could... The OED subsumes that into one definition because it's just a person who's carrying out church
particular
duties,
of course.
and those duties are both of the church.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so let's see here. So the bells are breaking down the tower.
Yes.
So how would you interpret that?
Poetry. Well, I remember I classify the tower as an effort at constructing or containing or censoring poetry. Poetry, though, will not be restricted and will not be censored in that sense. The impulse is for those bells, poetry, to break down that tower, that imposed structure, if you will, and swing I know not where. I like that because it's basically saying the bells cannot be pinned down, if you will. Poetry isn't predictable. It's not classifiable, that sort of thing. Does that make sense?
Well, hold on. I interpret it as my knowledge of my mortality inhibits my poetic composition.
So tell me how that works with that first line in particular.
Okay, so if we take tower to represent poetic composition, and the bells are knowledge of mortality. So you're hearing the bells and you're thinking about your funeral.
Yes.
So hearing these bells breaks down, it inhibits his poetic composition.
Okay.
Knowledge of his mortality inhibits his poetic composition.
And swing I know not where, it could be a reference to like the afterlife, maybe, or not knowing what comes after, so to speak.
Yeah.
Okay.
But how did I swing I know not where? Oh, I interpret it as it just harms me. But I'm very clueless about that. I really don't have a good idea of what that means.
Okay.
Swing I know not where. Okay, their tongues and no, maybe I just didn't interpret that part. Swing I know not where. So their tongues engrave membrane through marrow.
Mm-hmm.
I don't have a good theory, but it does seem kind of painful. Also, engrave kind of means set in stone. Right. So the bells, the tongues, the bells, which are poetry, the poetry is getting set in stone, and this is harming me.
Well, my interpretation, the tongues, which I take to be poetic expression, engrave membrane through marrow, right? Membrane is soft tissue, marrow is bone, so almost like it's working from the inside out. Poetry within me, engraving, it emerges from within, if you will. But to your point, though, the tongues engrave, play on word grave, which could pertain to your interpretation, of course.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, you could interpret it as put into the grave.
Yeah.
The poetry puts me into the grave.
But what does it mean when it says membrane through marrow?
Yeah, I don't really... So I don't get that, other than the fact that it seems kind of painful.
Right. Again, though, I think my original interpretation would be, poetic expression speaks from within and it becomes engraved without. And starts with the marrow, ends with the membrane.
Okay, how about my long scattered score of broken intervals? Now, also, just syntax.
Yes.
Their tongues engrave, membrane through marrow, and they also engrave my long scattered score.
I think tongues is poetic expression. Long scattered score is poetic composition.
Yeah, but it's scattered composition. It's
right. Well, it says long scattered of broken intervals. I'm inclined to say, his poetry is interrupted by society and by the censors. hence long scattered and there's broken intervals.
Mm-hmm.
He can only compose or express himself at certain times.
And also the fact that Marianne Moore, for example, she edited his poems. Not all of them.
Right.
I don't know if it was just one or I don't know. Okay. So, again, you interpret my long scattered score of broken intervals. And again, it's the tongues engrave my long scattered score.
No. No, my tongues engrave membrane through marrow. If that were the case, there'd be my tongues engrave.
But my scattered score is the object of the verb engrave.
I don't think there necessarily needs to be an object. Like I speak, my tongues engrave membrane through marrow.
And they also engrave my long scattered score.
No, my long scattered score of broken intervals is the tongues, I think. Which is the tongues, the clappers, the bells, being poetic expression.
I'm not sure if I agree with that.
My tongues engrave, membrane through marrow, my lungs. So it's almost like you're saying that this is like a list of things that the tongues are engraving.
Yeah, so if it's of the form X engraves Y, comma, Z, it follows that X engraves Y and X engraves Z.
Yeah, but I feel like structurally this would have to be my tongues engrave, my membrane through marrow, my long scattered score. Maybe the long scattered score is what is being engraved, membrane through marrow.
It's the object of the verb engrave.
Engrave, my long scattered score would be...
Yeah.
No, I'm still inclined to say his long scattered score of broken intervals refers to the tongues, and that score is the one that's being engraved, or emerging from within and from without.
Okay, and then either sexton slave.
Mm-hmm.
How did you interpret that?
So bells are poetic expression after they've been freed from the bell tower, freed from convention, and he is the slave of those bells, of his own poetic expression, poetic impulse.
Okay. I interpret it as I am forced to think of this fact. So.
Well, I mean, I don't get the term slave in a negative sense. It's almost like I am the slave of love, if you will, or I am the slave of the muse. There's sexton's slave. Basically, he is the slave of his own poetic impulse, his own desire to create poetry.
All right, so you have it as he's a slave to his own poetry. He can't resist not writing poetry.
Mm-hmm.
I have it as I'm forced to think of. So he's forced to ring the own bells
of his own mortality, is what you're saying. It sounds like.
Yeah, so he is forced to think of this fact. But let me at least write down your interpretation so that I can think about it. So oval and cyclical. All right, next stanza. Oval and cyclicals and canyons heaping the impasse high with choir, banked voices slain, pagodas, campaniles with reveilles outleaping. O terraced echoes prostrate on the plain. So I have encyclicals as doctrines that the poet tried to establish.
Well, we're dealing with religious theme. I think encyclicals, choir, even pagodas, which are religious in an Eastern sense. If you look at the beginning of the next stanza, it says, entered the broken world. So his world is characterized by heaped oval encyclicals. He uses the term impasse with the choir, slain voices, and the landscape is so broken. The landscape of poetry is so broken and overwhelmed by censorship, by imposition, that kind of thing. Does that make sense? And I was curious about the term oval, but I think that just refers. It's just a clever reference to the cyclic part of encyclicals.
Oh, that's a good idea, because I couldn't get that either. So let me write that down.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so...
Oh, interesting. I think the Visionary Company right here was where Bloom got the title for his book on English Romantics. The Visionary Company.
All right. Okay. Oval encyclicals and canyons heaping the impasse high with choir. I have it as the poet's doctrines caused an impasse with their music or poetry.
I'm not sure what you mean, though. How do his doctrines conflate his poetry?
His poetic doctrines cause an impasse among other people. It causes other people. His poetry was revolutionary.
Okay.
People had trouble understanding it.
Right.
So it caused an impasse in the world of poetry.
Okay. I think that may be feasible. My interpretation is all these encyclicals and the impasse, this is like the refuse. This is what convention and religion have done to the poetic world, is my thinking. So it almost conjures up like the idea of a rubbish heap.
All right.
Rubbish heap.
Okay, and then you would interpret banked voices slain as these encyclicals also contributed to...
The banked voices slain refer to the choir. The impasse high with choir.
Mm-hmm. But I interpret the voices as other poets. So in
other words, like other poets that have been repressed, broken down by convention, if you will. That could very well be the case. Yeah.
Yeah, but I don't really have a good explanation for banked unless it relates to finance. But
no, banked voices. I think banked just means heaped up, like river banks, for instance.
Oh, okay.
I'm pretty sure.
So they're heaped up.
Exactly.
Yeah. So like a lot of people. A lot of dead people making up a heap.
Yeah.
Hold on, let me write that down. Okay. This line is really tough. Pagodas, campaniles with revés out leaping.
Well, can you define for me revés?
That's just like an
alarm.
An alarm, I think. Like
an alarm, if you will.
The sound. Let's just double check.
Yeah, let's verify. I mean, we know pagodas. Campaniles. What are campaniles?
That's another bell tower, but that's like the Italian word for it.
Sure. I would say, the landscape is just dominated by all these different, bell towers, all these different efforts and means of constraining poetry by doctrine, that kind of thing. Yeah,
and also reveille does have a military connotation, so it's the morning signal mostly for soldiers.
Okay. And so again, it's repetition of the morning signal we encountered in the first stanza.
Mm-hmm.
Gathering God at dawn.
But these temples or these other bell towers with their morning signals, they're leaping. So I mean, what does this mean?
It's just with music, with the sounding bells, like leaping music being projected from the bell towers. I would say.
Yeah, that's actually what I wrote down. So I think we agree on that point.
So all of these bells in the bell towers, these are the sanctioned means of expression, if you will.
Okay, so now terraced echoes prostrate on the plain.
Terraced echoes? Well,
Now I don't have a good explanation for terraced.
Terraced echoes. Well, I think terrace would just indicate features of the landscape. Because when we have the canyons heaping, we have the impasses high with choir. So terraces, it just implies things that are heaped up, if you will.
All right. Well, I interpreted echoes as other poets who aren't very original. They're just echoing.
But again, terraced echoes. These are the consequences of these bell towers across the land. So not other poets per se, but
But they're prostrate.
What about it?
Well, the echoes are prostrate, so we do have some anthropomorphism here.
And terraced, of course, echoes aren't terraced. Prostrate on the plain, perhaps a realization that this kind of poetry, this kind of expression, will never attain any high degree of accomplishment, maybe?
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, but I interpreted, well, it actually doesn't really matter because you're saying the echoes refers to the sound, and the sound is kind of poetry. Whereas I'm saying these are actual poets,
right?
But it doesn't really matter all that much.
Well, it's interesting to call a poet an echo. It's like almost like an imitator. A poet who just imitates and takes from someone else, for instance.
Hold on a second.
So
all right, go ahead.
So also, when it says terraced echoes, could that pertain to a lack of originality, or just to the repetition of like ritual music? That kind of thing. Does that make sense?
No.
Terraced echoes.
By the way,
I guess the echo aspect will refer to a lack of originality in religious music, I think.
yeah, but what about terrace? That's what I'm worried about.
There are so many echoes, it's almost like, it's kind of a weird mixed metaphor, but there are so many echoes, and it just piles up, really, I guess you could say. It just becomes kind of like a multiplying burden almost.
Like maybe they're stacked up, like they're stacked in order.
Or even just overlapping.
They're standardized.
Maybe terrace could just mean overlapping.
Overlapping, yeah.
Yeah, so it's the same thing again and again and again. That kind of thing. Yeah.
Now, also in canyons, we didn't really discuss that either.
Encyclicals and canyons. So I think this just means when all of these encyclicals are heaped up, you're inevitably going to have canyons, gaps between the heaps, if you will.
Okay. All right, so let's move on to the next stanza. Okay. And so it was I entered the broken world to trace the visionary company of love, its voice an instant in the wind, I know not whither hurled, but not for long to hold each desperate choice. Mm-hmm. So I have, entered the broken world, pretty obvious, a world not in a good state. It's not in an ideal state. It's got a lot of problems with it. Yeah. Trace the visionary company of love. It's his job to talk about the nature of love in his poetry. Okay. And then its voice an instance of the wind. His poetic voice was an instance of spirit. So I'm interpreting wind as spirit. Mm-hmm. I know not whither hurled. He doesn't know exactly what he's doing. He's got some doubts. He doesn't know the whole nature of love. Right. But the last line is a little difficult. But not for long to hold each desperate choice. So I interpreted hold as judge. And then each desperate choice is the choice of a lover. So he's judging these choices by lovers and wondering if they make the right decision.
Well, my interpretation, the broken world refers to the preceding stanza. Mm-hmm. This is the world of poetry that has been broken by censorship, by convention, etc. So his mission to trace the visionary company of love, mm-hmm. I'm inclined to say that refers to the great poets, and that have been their voices have been lost in all this in this landscape, if you will. It's a voice, an instant in the wind. It's like it's a very difficult search. There will be these. Occasionally there will be a clue. Occasionally there will be a hint, but they disappear very quickly because they're so overwhelmed by censorship, that kind of thing. I know not whither hurled. Yet that just means.
Hold on. Say that again. Its voice an instance in the wind. Say that again. Your interpretation.
Right. So the visionary company of love. I'm taking that to mean all the great poets.
Yeah, I got that.
And I want to reinforce that. Harold Bloom's book, The Visionary Company, drawn from this very line, I think, was about the great English Romantic poets. Mm-hmm. So he's looking for these poets. The voice, an instant in the wind. Mm-hmm. He can only search for fugitive traces of this poetry. It's very difficult to locate. Very difficult to find in this landscape. It says, "I know not whither hurled." I guess that just means to say that even if you can't find a source so much.
Hold on. Let me. Okay, so and then your last line, "Not for long to hold each desperate choice." How do you interpret that?
Well, we have to look at the structure of the stanza. So it's an either or. He can enter the broken world to trace the visionary company, or hold each desperate choice. Desperation, so he'll find one of these remnants, right, and he'll seize onto it and not move further into finding the rest of them, if that makes sense. He'd be so frightened of losing what he's found that in desperation he's not going to seek out the visionary company of love.
Oh, so he's grasping at straws.
Yes, and when he finds a straw, he's not letting that straw go.
Okay.
And he's not going to move to find anything else.
But he doesn't hold on to it for long when he grasps at this straw.
Right.
All right. Hold on.
Hey, honey. Hey, baby girl.
Okay, next stanza.
Okay.
Okay, my word I poured, but was it cognate scored of that tribunal monarch of the air, whose thigh and bronze's earth strikes crystal word in wounds pledged once to hope, cleft to despair. So my word I poured, I interpret word as a synecdoche for poetry. So
Okay.
he wrote poetry, and then he asked himself, was it similar to that cruel deity? This is a cruel deity.
Mm-hmm.
In his thigh and bronzes. This kind of makes it pagan, because pagan gods, they can have thighs and arms and all of that.
Well,
So-
let me say, I mean, there's anthropomorphization in Judeo-Christianity. Thigh and bronze earth, I think of that line, Colossus bestride the earth, so to speak.
where's that line from?
I don't recall. Colossus bestride the earth, I'm not sure.
Haven't heard that one.
But whose thigh embraces her. It's something like I'm thinking of that, like the god Atlas almost.
Mm-hmm.
But then we see strikes crystal word, capital W. So now I'm thinking this is the Judeo-Christian deity who is summoned or named at the very first line of Broken Tower. Go ahead, I'm sorry.
Well, but do you interpret strikes crystal word in wounds pledged once to hope, cleft to do you interpret that as negative or positive?
Negative.
Yeah, so this is a
I almost think of like jagged crystal almost being plunged into these wounds.
Yeah. So is this a negative god? Is this a...
Oh, negative, definitely.
Okay.
What I'm thinking is, my word I poured, then he asks, was it cognate? Or, in other words, is it free from the influence of religion? Is it free from the influence of the censors, that kind of thing?
I don't know about that. So he wrote poetry, and then he wonders, was this poetry similar to that cruel pagan god that...
No. So remember, tribunal monarch of air just represents convention and censorship in religion at its site. He's saying, I poured out my word.
Oh, so hold on.
Go ahead, I'm sorry.
You're saying that the tribunal monarch is poetic convention.
Or God. Yeah, the negative convention we're talking about. Whether it be in the church, censorship. So my word I poured, and then I'm asking, have I truly freed it from the influence that I want to evade? You know, God.
This is a good idea. Let me write this down.
Mm-hmm.
And by the way, just as an example of how Crane will play with prepositions, so cleft to despair, I have that as cleft into despair is probably the more standard.
Well, cleft is interesting. I think cleft is part of cleave, and cleave can mean separating from. It also means keeping very close to.
Yeah, because in the Bible, like it says, like it uses that word.
So cleave.
So and so cleaved unto his wife.
Right. So cleft to despair. In other words, if I'm still under the influence of this system, my poetry is still cleft to despair. Stuck.
But it's sort of whichever way if you interpret cleft as separate or if you interpret as putting together, it still basically is negative.
Right, but it's not cleft from despair, it's cleft to despair. You know what I mean?
But you could also interpret it as cleft into despair. So it's split into pieces.
Cleft into despair.
Can like split into pieces.
Maybe, yeah.
Okay. All right. So let's go on to the next stanza.
Mm-hmm.
The steep encroachments of my blood left me no answer. Could blood hold such a lofty tower as flings the question true? Or is it she whose sweet mortality stirs latent power? So again, I have blood as lifeblood, energy, or inspiration.
Mm-hmm.
Steep encroachments. I would interpret that as... Well, I didn't really interpret steep encroachments.
Steep encroachments in my blood, I think it's like a racing pulse.
Okay, the pulse of my blood.
Steep encroachment, yeah.
So my inspiration, I didn't get the answer I was searching for with my inspiration.
Well, the question is posed right here in the stanza 6. And it says, no answer. So the encroachments of my blood left me no answer. So I don't know whether or not I'm truly out from under this influence. But could blood hold such a lofty tower as things? I'm kind of saying like the concern itself over influence may be part of that imposition. Does that make sense?
So you're saying like, could my inspiration have an influence over the orthodox poetic
What I'm
establishment.
saying, so in the preceding stanzas, it's like, "Am I free of the influence of the powers that be?" That's the term we'll use for convention, religion, etc. And now he's saying right here, he doesn't know. His rising passions, the sinking of his blood, his passion. Yeah, right. He doesn't actually know, and so I'm wondering. So he doesn't know, obviously, and then it says, "I'm so sorry. Bear with me." Could blood hold such a lofty tower as flings the question true? What was your interpretation of that again?
Could my inspiration build a successful poetic composition?
Okay, let's see. Bear with me here. I think this is saying concern over influence is part of the whole part of the powers that be. Could blood hold? So this lofty tower is that which constrains poetry, right?
But you have to admit that calling the tower lofty,
Yes,
does poke a hole in your interpretation, because he wouldn't really call the poetic establishment lofty.
Well, I don't think it's lofty in terms of merit. It's just very prominent. It's a tall tower. It's very prominent, casts a long shadow, that kind of thing.
But, I mean, yeah, you could say that, but I still kind of think he would use a different adjective.
It could be ironic.
I mean, it could, but, I mean, you can come up with a reason, but I think this might be evidence against your theory.
No. I'm not inclined to see that true. Look, as flings the question true. This it sounds positive, but I think it's in an ironic sense. And lofty, I honestly think that just means it casts a long shadow. It's been built up to such a height, really. And so he's saying that in his blood there is not that lofty tower. And then the question true is the question he's asking about: has he freed himself of influence, if you will? I think what this is saying is that the concern for influence or over influence is part of the system he's trying to evade.
All right.
And then I like it, but then it says, "Or is it she whose sweet mortality stirs latent power?" I think that. How do you interpret that?
I interpret it as, so she refers to the fact that we will soon die. Hold on.
Okay, I'm sorry, go ahead.
So, or does the fact that we will soon die inspire us to be more creative?
But it says sweet mortality.
Yeah, so she whose sweet mortality. So this is the fact that we will soon die. Does this inspire us to be creative?
I think it's probably a little more concrete than that. She whose sweet mortality is just the beloved. And her approaching death stirs the poetic impulse, really.
But he hasn't really mentioned the beloved yet so far,
Right.
in this poem. But
And of course, she whose sweet mortality, the beloved, stirs these steep encroachments of the blood, or it causes the blood to race, the pulse to race.
all right. Well, let me write this down. Okay, so we'll just do 3 lines from this stanza. And through whose pulse I hear, counting the strokes, my veins recall and add, revived and sure, the Angelus of wars my chest evokes.
So the Angelus of wars my chest evokes, that pertains to the heart, I think. Through whose pulse I hear. I think this is just we're reaching a height of passion at this point. Angelus of wars my chest evokes, the beating of the heart as compared to the ringing of the bells.
Oh, and by the way, I have this as a OSV sentence, so it's
OSV?
object, subject, verb.
Okay.
My chest evokes the Angelus of wars.
No, yes, I agree entirely.
Yeah, and by the way, Angelus, I thought it was just bells ringing, but it's actually a particular bell.
A particular bell?
It's the bells where Gabriel announced to Mary that she was going to be pregnant.
Okay, so, okay.
But let me double check that, because I might be wrong.
Angelus. Let's see what it says.
Devotional exercise commemorating the mystery of the Incarnation, consisting of versicles and responses. So it's more of a of a ritual at church.
Right.
Or then it's also short for Angelus Bell. But Kramer talks about it in his annotation of the bridge.
And it's interesting because it is the Angelus of Wars, which is intriguing. And I just take this to mean the height of passion. And the Angelus of Wars, it's that hammering of heart in the chest. And at the height of this passion...
Well, I interpret it as my mind starts thinking about my imminent death.
Angelus of Wars, though? I mean,
Yeah.
Angelus announced to me...
Angelus of Wars is kind of like...
No, I think it's just the hammering of heart. This is the Angelus Wars. It's the height of... Because it's bells. Angelus Wars, it's the height of poetic inspiration, if you will.
All right, and through whose pulse... How about the first two lines?
Okay.
I interpret it as through the pulse of my heart, my mind recalls bells which resound due to my imminent death.
Let's see. Through the pulse I hear. So counting the strokes my veins recall and add. This is just referring to the circulation of blood and passion, I think. And in that circulation, we have to keep in mind that the heart's being equated to a bell, if you will. And it's just, I think it's the height of passion, the height of poetic influence, or poetic inspiration. And this is interesting because it says, "What I hold, healed, original, now, and pure." He knows it says original and pure, so he knows he's finally pushed through and broken free of influence, which was the concern of the two preceding stanzas.
Yeah.
This has been his goal. This is victory, if you will. He's broken free of influence and of the censors and of the powers that be.
Well, that's a good idea. Okay. So again, these first three lines you interpret as what again?
It's simply it's mounting passion and mounting poetic inspiration, and that superlative is the Angelus of Wars.
Okay. All right. So you want to know what I take of the ellipses? I don't pay attention to those. I really don't. I don't really think you can. His punctuation is pretty random. I don't see much.
Maybe it's just. I mean, he holds healed, original, now, and pure, but he doesn't know the extent of this, so to speak. He doesn't know the. Oh, hello. Hey, sweetheart. Yeah, you may be right for the ellipsis. I don't think the ellipsis is terrible.
Okay. All right, so let's go with. And by the way, I put the word "is" between hold and healed.
What I hold is healed. What I hold, healed.
What I hold is
He's
healed.
not really identifying the object itself. He's just saying what I hold, healed, original, pure. But he doesn't say exactly what he's holding.
No, but I just put the word "is" to make it grammatically correct. He's just.
Oh, I see what you mean. Okay. Yeah. Okay.
All right. So let's keep reading. And builds within a tower that is not stone can jacket heaven, but slip of pebbles. Visible wings of silence sewn in azure circles, widening as they dip. The matrix of the heart lift down the eye that shines the quiet lake and swells a tower. Now let's just stop there.
Okay.
So, how do you interpret that?
Well, this poetic impulse is going to build a new tower, a replacement tower inside of himself, but it is not a tower dictating the form of poetry. The slip of pebbles, for instance. So it accommodates poetry, but it changes with the needs of poetry, is my interpretation.
No, that's interesting because, well, all right, so you're interpreting stone as the Orthodox establishment. It's stone, it's lifeless,
Right, which
rigid.
cannot jacket heaven, right there.
Yeah, so jacket I would interpret as like imitate.
Or well, I would say like literally straight jacket heaven. It can't contain or entrap heaven, if you will. Well, he's basically saying that the tower he's building is not the tower we start with. It's not the stone that will jacket heaven or inspiration.
He's going to build a new tower.
Right, but it's not a tower built of doctrine and mandate and censorship. It's a slip of pebbles, so it can change its form, if you will, based on the needs of the poetry of the poet.
Well, see, I think you're right, but I originally interpreted that as completely different. So
how did you interpret it?
I interpreted it as a slip of pebbles is like something that falls down and falls apart and is broken. And
It's something I take slip of pebbles, not just simply to mean something that can change form. It's malleable. It can accommodate the needs of the poet and poetry.
Okay.
Now, what do you think of visible wings of silence?
Sewn in azure circles.
Right, well, I mean, obviously, it's an avian metaphor, right? Azure circles would be the gyres of the bird.
Oh yeah, just his poetry is going to be flying through heaven.
Right. But why wings of silence?
Yeah.
And why visible wings of silence?
Well, I can get wings.
Yeah,
I can understand that. Visible, okay. You can see the poetry. It's, I don't know. I mean, that's not very. We're not going to be able to interpret that with any degree of certainty. Why they're silent? I don't know. No. I originally interpreted it as negative, meaning nobody's going to read it.
Right. Well, personally, I think this whole thing, this new Tower of the Heart, is entirely positive. Is my interpretation.
But do you think he's saying like nobody's going to read his poems?
I do not get that impression. No.
Well, let's actually read.
Well, it's within his heart. It's internal. So maybe silence just means there's not this clamor that's going to overwhelm his poetry, like the bell we're dealing with at the very beginning.
Mm-hmm.
And I do take silence to be positive.
But we gotta ask ourselves, whose heart is this? His heart or somebody else's?
I think it's his heart. 100%, because it refers back to the Angelus or Angelus of War's My Chest of Oaks, which was the heart metaphor.
All right. So the wings are going to be sewn in heaven. We agree that azure circles refers to heaven.
I think it just means we're dealing with flight, and in azure, it's that gyre of a bird, flying, and azure just means it's a gyre in the sky, I think.
Well, azure means blue, though.
Right. Right.
Okay.
Blue sky, blue heaven.
Yeah.
I'm a little confused on the metaphor still, though. What's confusing me is visible and silence. Maybe something gets seen but not heard.
But do you think my interpretation is he's pessimistic that people are going to read these poems?
No, I get no hint of pessimism in this, because what I hold healed, original now, and pure, that's a victory statement.
But that doesn't... You can write pure and original poems, but you can also believe that people aren't going to read them.
No, I'm still inclined to interpret this entirely as positive, frankly. Hold on. The matrix of the heart now lifts down the eye.
It shines the quiet lake and swells the tower.
Right. Is that supposed to be like a mandate? Or is it simply...
I have it as closes the eye because it is sad since no one understands his poems.
So lift down the eye, you're saying, is the closing of the eye. My thinking is that there's a difference. We're no longer focused... Okay, so azure circles widening as they lift down the eye. We're taking our focus away from heaven and from principles and from mandates, and we're focusing now on what's in the heart, if you will. So it's a change in focus. It's a change. We're no longer looking at God. We're no longer looking at the mandates of the church, that kind of thing. We have a new focus now.
So you would say, like, he's going to divert his eye away from the orthodox poetry, which...
He lifts down his eye from the powers that be, from convention, from society, from God, from the church, these lofty ideals.
Okay.
And he's going to focus on something entirely different, which is in the last 3 lines, I think.
All right, hold on a second. All right, go ahead.
Okay, no, I think my interpretation is off, because... bear with me, I'm sorry. It says the tower cannot jacket heaven, which would mean in this case that heaven is poetic, is the realm of poetic inspiration, not God, deity, Christianity, etc. Maybe it's saying that inspiration, lifting down the eye, and inspiration is now something that's going to be found within and hence free of all influence. What do you think?
Well, I still gotta think about whether or not I accept your whole thesis about the tower being poetic Orthodox establishment, which I am leaning towards it. I am leaning towards it, but I haven't decided yet if I want to go with it.
Well, I will say this: looking at the line, so he's erecting a new tower in the place of mandate, poetic convention, whatever, and his new tower, the one that we said is not of stone, the jacket's heaven. It's commodious, it's tall, and it unseals the earth and lifts love in its shower. So I'm really inclined to say we're dealing with a replacement. We've escaped the influence of convention, of censorship, and we have risen a new tower that elevates, a new tower that lifts love in its shower. And you will recall that it said that the purpose of him being in this broken world was to find the visionary company of love. And love is in the very last section right here, last line as well. So he has victory. He's succeeded in breaking free of influence of censorship. He's risen his own tower, and this is the closing lines. I don't think are pessimistic or morbid at all. This is a victory poem, if you will.
Yeah,
is my interpretation.
All right, but you picked up on something that I missed. So you think that for the last two lines, there's like a verb missing. So he's saying the subject of the sentence is the visible wings, where the subject is still wings.
Okay.
So the wings are going to widen as they dip into the heart. They're going to lift down the eye, and then they're also going to build up the commodious tall decorum of that sky,
which is the new tower.
All right. So
and it says commodious, so it's not that constriction, if you will.
So you think the verb build up should come after the word swells a tower. So after swells a tower, then and builds up.
Look, swells a tower is the same. It swells a tower, and then it's describing tower. It swells a tower, and this tower is the commodious tall.
Okay. Yeah. All right. Okay. All right. So let me write this down. So once again, lift down the eye. How do you interpret that?
Lift down the eye. Lift down the eye. Is it saying the eye shrines the quiet lake?
Maybe.
Oh, I get it. So shrines the quiet lake and tower. Lift down the eye. It's like when you're before like royalty or like a religious object. You kind of look down really and defer.
It directs the eye.
It directs the eye, or it just means it acknowledges a certain level of reverence, and that the eye looks down sort of.
Okay.
Does that make sense? Lift down the eye that shrines the quiet lake and swells a tower.
But if you're going to interpret that as the
it's almost like kind of like a reverent deferral almost.
But why would this new poetry that he's crafting? Why would it be deferential to royalty?
No. I'm just looking at lift down the eye.
Yeah, but the subject of lift is the poetry, right?
I think it's the poet.
All right, so the poet. So why would the poet be deferential to royalty?
Well, I'm not saying it's deferential to royalty. So it says he should lift down the eye that shrines the quiet lake.
I kind of think that's more. It directs the eye to the lake that he's going. The lake is what he's going to cultivate.
Maybe, but if it says shrine, like it's a religious object, when you approach a religious object, it's almost like a sign of reverence and respect to lower one's gaze. Which is what I'm interpreting.
What he's saying is, his eyes are going to make the lake beautiful. They're going to enshrine the lake with holiness.
I'd say that he already enshrines the lake and treats it as holy. I think this is lift down the eye. I think it's just a sign of reverence, because he's deprived the powers that be, convention, censorship, religion, of reverence, and so it's like this is what his new religion is. Hence, shrines the quiet lake and swells a tower. That is my interpretation.
Well, but swells a tower means he's going to build a new tower of poetry.
Or it just means swells a tower. No, I don't think he's going to build a new one. Swells a tower just means it's very, very prominent. This is what grows out of the landscape.
But we've already established that he's building a new tower.
Right.
So he's talking again about the new tower he's going to build.
Yes.
It's going to be bigger.
Yes.
All right, so we're in agreement then.
Yes, but again, lift down the eye. I'm still not clear on the meaning behind that.
Hold on. Okay, so for the final 6 or 7 lines we have, I'm going to build a new tower, not lifeless like the old poetic establishments. Its stone cannot imitate heaven, but it will be dynamic and adaptive, and it will keep growing as it goes into the heart. And so you kind of really weren't able to interpret enshrines the quiet lake. So I just go with my interpretation, which is it enshrines nature with beauty, and then it enlarges a new tower of poetry, which is commodious, unlike the old tower, and will allow a connection between earth and sky, and will encourage love.
I do have an interpretation of shrines to Quiet Lake. Quiet Lake is the counterpart of this tortuous landscape that's so overburdened and so destroyed by convention, etc., etc. So the Quiet Lake is just a serenity, untouched by these demands, censorship, etc.
But what would the verb be?
Shrines?
Yeah. Enshrines. Okay, so it enshrines the lake with serenity.
Well, shrines, I think means just conveys a certain level of reverence on something. It's his eye shrining of the lake, etc., etc., etc. It's his eye holding. It's a sign of his reverence for this new tower and this quiet lake.
All right, we're done.